Hello, I'm Michael Appel. In this explainer, I'd like to break down the findings of a recent report that was released by the South African Human Rights Commission's expert panel looking into the violent, destructive and deadly riots that engulfed KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng in July last year. Let's wind the clock back. Timing is of course everything. Former President Jacob Zuma had just handed himself over to authorities to start serving a 15-month prison sentence for contempt of court when all hell broke loose in this country, wiping out 50 billion from our economy and killing over 350 people. This report focuses on the KZN riots primarily, where roughly 80% of the looting and destruction was focused. I'm going to try and answer a few simple questions I'm sure we all have. Was the July unrest a spontaneous outpouring of rage caused by the incarceration of Jacob Zuma, or something more sinister and calculated? Were the scenes of anarchy the culmination of infighting between different camps in the ANC? Were any rogue characters or units within state security or crime intelligence loyal to the former president believed to be linked or actively involved in fueling the mayhem? Did organized crime have a hand in this, as the panel suggests, or was this a mixture of explosive socioeconomic factors aligning with the whims of criminals and a faction of the ANC? Is it fair to say police and intelligence structures failed completely in their mandates? Could this have been avoided? In other words, were there warnings? Has our government learned anything out of the July unrest it didn't already know? Can or might something like this, and on this scale, actually happen again? Is the recent sacking or mutual agreement to leave of the National Police Commissioner KwaZulu-Natal a positive development for policing in South Africa? Should Police Minister Becky Cele have been booted out as well? I've asked a policing expert from the Institute for Security Studies, Gareth Newham, to answer these questions for you in a separate video, which I'll link to as well. Back to it. The answers to some of the questions start to come pretty quick and fast. On the third page of the report, there's this, quote, "The looting, destruction and violence have come and gone, but we found that little has changed in the conditions that led to the unrest, leaving the public worried that there might be similar eruptions of large-scale unrest in future. The question many argue is not if and whether more unrest and violence will occur, but when it will occur." Close quote. Off the bat, just so you're all aware, this expert panel that produced this report, it didn't have powers of subpoena, so it couldn't summon anyone and it couldn't seize or demand any documentation. It relied on the goodwill and cooperation of those approached for information. So don't get this confused with the Commission of Inquiry, which has significantly greater powers of compulsion. So testimony before the expert panel wasn't, in many cases, backed up by documentary evidence. A lot of it was deemed classified and so never came before the panel. This expert panel took a look at the context in which this all unfolded, and these are important points. Think of these as the ingredients for chaos it identified. Weak state institutions hollowed out by almost a decade of state capture and repurposing for individual and party political gain. High unemployment, in fact the highest youth unemployment in the world, about 75%. Mass poverty and the highest level of inequality in the world. Rampant corruption in government, and anger fermenting in the population amidst growing frustration at COVID-19 restrictions. The report says all of these factors are themselves a recipe for constant instability in any country. The National Intelligence Coordination Committee, with the rather unfortunate acronym NICOC, warned government prior to 2021 that it needs to address the above-mentioned issues, but, quote, "It appeared not many members of the executive appreciated the meaning of the warnings raised in the reports and largely ignored them. The need to stop corruption in government and start addressing the needs of the people kept being kicked down the road like the proverbial can." Close quote. Interestingly, The report found that the back and forth, the tit-for-tat battles between Zuma and the state capture inquiry over a period of about 8 months was a major factor in the build-up to the violence and looting. Quote, "The incarceration of the former president at a correctional facility in Escort was the spark that ignited the orgy of violence." The day after Zuma is jailed, the 9th of July, a number of trucks are torched on the N3 highway, the arterial lifeblood linking KZN and Gauteng. Attacks on shopping centers followed.
This is Moy River Top's spa. I just broke into.
The report finds that there were, quote, "elements of organization behind the looting combined with opportunistic looting," close quote. Now, this is important. The planners wanted authorities to think it was spontaneous. The panel even coined a new phrase, organized spontaneity. The panel says that state security or crime intelligence made no intelligence products available to it. Now, intelligence products are just reports produced for a client, in this case the state. So, state machinery wasn't playing open cards with the panel here. It says, quote, "What we can conclude is that the National Security Council, as a structure, does not seem to have received any clear, direct intelligence about the impending violence prior to it happening." I just want to stop here for a second and refer to an extract from a book called 8 Days in July. It was written by journalists in the wake of the July riots and is based on leaked documents, intelligence briefs, and reports from across the state security cluster. So documents the panel has never seen. In the conclusion of that book, it notes, "Our investigation pointed to an intelligence alert on 11 May, 2 months before this all kicked off, of the upheaval that was to come." But the authors ask whether such a vague warning was enough to avert the crisis that unfolded. Evidently, the warning, arguably thin on detail, was ignored. As for the actions of the police once it had all kicked off, the panel finds there is no doubt that the police had insufficient capacity to stop the violence. There are about 180,000 cops in this country. Not all of them are operational, obviously. And at the time the riots broke out, the Public Order Policing Unit, POPs, of the SAPS numbered only 5,500, whereas the ideal operational strength required is over 12,700. The riots happened simultaneously in areas that are far from each other and took on a form of anarchy unfamiliar to even South Africa. That is, the targeted looting and torching of shopping malls and warehouses. The failure of reliable intelligence points to the urgent need to implement the recommendations of the 2018 High-Level Review Panel on the State Security Agency. That's a report commissioned by Cyril Ramaphosa that found in a nutshell that the SSA, the State Security Agency, had been compromised by factionalism, mismanagement, and inefficiency. Actually, in the state capture inquiry, we heard how the SSA allegedly became a cash cow for Zuma, and how he created a parallel security regime loyal only to him and effective in tackling his political enemies. The July riots expert panel finds there was a failure by the intelligence structures to anticipate and respond adequately to the violence. At this point, the report makes a general recommendation to security services. Use all lawful levers available to them, in particular the need to intercept communications in a lawful manner, where the security of the state is at stake. The State Security Agency says it provided the necessary threat assessment and intelligence before, during, and after the crisis. The SSA says months prior to the Constitutional Court ruling sentencing Zuma to prison it had reports mobilization by groups in support of the former president with possible imminent violence that could arise. But as I've mentioned before, this is simply their version. It's not necessarily backed by any actual documentation placed in the public domain or before this expert panel. To add further confusion to this whole situation, on 8 July 2021, the day before the riots began, the Office of the Coordinator for Intelligence received a document from State Security categorically stating, quote, that no information had been identified suggesting that supporters of former President Zuma would gather and protest in a specific area in the province after the former president handed himself over to authorities in compliance with the warrant of his arrest as issued by the Constitutional Court on 29 June 2021, close quote. The panel doesn't know who authored or sent that report that came out on the eve of the violence, but it's fair to say it's complete hogwash. Within the police's chain of command, it's a mess. You have Police Minister Bheki Cele, who was well known, was not on good terms with then National Police Commissioner Kehla Sithole. When Cele testified, he claimed he hadn't received any intelligence report or briefing from either the National Commissioner or the Divisional Commissioner for Crime Intelligence since at least December 2020. That's pretty terrifying. In his testimony, the police minister was also critical of the National Police Commissioner for not visiting the affected areas. The National Commissioner, however, testified that he believed he was best placed to coordinate all responses from a national operations center. The report makes the finding that, quote, the minister and the National Commissioner are poles apart in their interpretation of how the events of July could have been managed, close quote. Since this report has come out, the National Police Commissioner has been sacked by the president, but more from Gareth Newham on that point in my interview with him. The report notes, unbelievably, that at a time when we needed all hands on deck, there was rank being thrown around on the ground between the SAPS and the South African National Defence Force, which was then ultimately deployed by the president on the 12th of July. The report finds that SAPS initially excluded the SANDF from intelligence briefings. A colonel in the military was excluded from briefings due to him having a lower rank in comparison to his police counterparts. Quote, as a result, the SANDF was not clear as to where to deploy members, close quote. Finally, the report finds that there has been a lack of adequate technological innovation and undercapacitation of the security services that ultimately hampered their efficient operations. Quote, much of the mobilization took place on cyber platforms, and the services had not been agile and aggressive enough in their modernization to keep up with this. I don't know how you interpret this, but to me this means police, intelligence, and state security agencies had no means by which to counter, infiltrate, or shut down the widespread use of WhatsApp groups and Twitter, used very successfully to incite and coordinate violent attacks. These riots are the most costly in our country's history. That's according to SASRIA, the South African Special Risk Insurance Association. Some 14,000 claims were submitted to it, totaling 30 billion rand, divided between KZN and Gauteng on an 80-20 split. Security experts and veterans of the intelligence community testified that it was obvious that the violence had been orchestrated, deliberate, and coordinated. These were not the actions of ordinary people. The ringleaders of the violence remain largely faceless. The president told the nation they have identified 12 instigators who would be charged, but there's been a handful of individuals identified based on their inflammatory social media accounts, and they've been charged with nothing more than incitement to violence, finds the report. The mastermind or masterminds would be guilty of terrorist activity, from the methods used to loot and then destroy the logistics network between KZN and Gauteng. The report notes organized crime was likely involved. In essence, the panel finds Cabinet must take overall responsibility for what unfolded. intelligence structures failed completely to anticipate, prevent, or disrupt the planned and orchestrated violence. The police's response failed because it wasn't driven by any intelligence and failed to adapt to the modus operandi on the ground. The soldiers who were deployed didn't know where to be deployed to make an impact, and they were not equipped to handle riot situations. But their show of force did restore calm. The internal differences within the governing party, the ANC, contributed to the unrest and should be addressed as a matter of national security now. Let that sink in, as it must for the ANC. Their internal squabbles for power and position are a threat to national security. Thanks for watching.